The Rise of China, Episode 2, China's Economic Risks and Challenges. Welcome to KJ Vids and Episode 2 of The Rise of China. In the previous episode, we had a look at the scale of China's rise today to understand why China has become a favorite by analysts around the world to become the great power of the 21st century. In this episode, we will take a look at the challenges that China will have to overcome in order to assert its influence over the world. China's debt bubble. In May 2017, the credit rating agency Moody's cut China's debt rating for the first time since 1989 and warned that the country's financial health is suffering from rising debt and slowing economic growth. More recently, S&P Global Ratings downgraded China's sovereign rating for the first time since 1999, citing the country's greater economic and financial risks. These fears about debt levels in the world's second-largest economy have reignited debate over the fundamentals of China's future. Whether the country is leaping over the middle-income trap with a leaner and more sustainable growth model, or whether it is on a debt-fueled path to disaster. But where did this debt come from? China's state enterprise. As growth in the West collapsed following the global financial crisis of 2008, China's local governments and state-owned companies borrowed heavily to build cities and roads, invest in businesses, and bolster financial markets. That spending spree has resulted in a domestic debt hangover, particularly among some of the country's bloated and inefficient state-owned companies. Corporate debt in China soared to around 170% of GDP in 2016, roughly double the average of other economies. In 2008, this figure stood at about 100%. Such figures have been used to undermine the strength of China's economy, but there are unique differences to China's economy compared to Western economies. First, in China, borrowers are often state-owned enterprises or local governments, and lenders are state-owned banks. In other countries, lenders and borrowers are usually private. If the borrower and lender are both state-owned, any financial problem eventually becomes a budget issue, and the outcome depends on the financial strength of the government. Second, land prices have increased on average from 400% to 800% over the last decade, which is unusual. So a lot of debt in China is actually financing the costs of land and the transfer of property, although many observers haven't realized it. Property prices went from essentially zero when state-owned to something which is quite high and comparable to global market values. Although China has a debt, property is valuable, and the increase in debt is the result of financial markets recognizing its value. China's fiscal system. For China's local governments, the budget system is weak, households don't pay much income tax, and there is no property tax. In the US, local government budgets are large and dependent on property taxes. When localities want to build a road, they don't borrow from banks. In China, local governments often borrow for infrastructure and other activities. China needs to move to a financial system which is less bank-dependent, and this means improving the budget system. Another aspect is that localities in China own land. They sell land to developers and get money to finance schools or roads, but sometimes they go too far. They build too many malls and houses which then become vacant. Sometimes they drive up prices because they want to develop more to generate more revenues, but this can lead to overbuilding and excess unsold properties. With a stronger fiscal system, there is less incentive to overbuild. Thus, China's debt problem is not really a banking issue, but is a budget problem. China's real estate. Prices have increased in Shenzhen, Beijing, and Shanghai much more than in second and third-tier cities. This is because of the excess supply of unsold housing in the smaller cities relative to the larger cities. the government is telling everyone, please move to smaller cities. Thus, local economies have been building more in the small and medium-sized cities. But people are not coming. Even though property prices are lower, people are more focused on getting a better job, and the higher-paying jobs are usually in the bigger cities. Government policies are also distorting the housing market. A property bubble usually occurs when government policies attempt to promote more sales and construction than market conditions warrant. Zoning and building regulations distort prices and often make prices too high in major cities. Restrictions on migration distort demand. People should be allowed to move to where they can find good jobs. In addition, China's major cities are not as densely developed in its core as cities in other countries, and thus development is pushed out to the suburbs. This makes centrally located property too expensive. The tendency to tighten and then ease guidelines for buying homes also encourages bubbles. China's competition. Chinese firms have proved they can make good products for less. Consumer prices for televisions, adjusted for quality, fell by more than 90% in the 15 years after China joined the World Trade Organization. China's share of global exports has risen to 14%, the highest any country has reached since the US in 1968. That may fall as China loses its grip on low-value industries such as textiles, but it is gaining a new reputation in high-tech. If data is the new oil, China's tech industry has vast reserves in the information generated by the hundreds of millions of its people online, unprotected by privacy rules. Whether you make cars in Germany, semiconductors in the US, or robots in Japan, the chances are that in future, some of your fiercest rivals will be Chinese. China's dilemma. China's success with boosting low-cost goods in advanced economies resulted in an investment boom by Westerners in China. Investors prospered during the surge, but it was at the cost of damaging the economies of China's customers in two ways. First, low-cost goods undermined businesses in the consuming country. Second, investment capital flowed out of the consuming countries and into China. Like Japan's economy in the past, it has built much of its growth on exports. Both China and Japan were poor countries and demand for goods was low. They jump-started their economies by taking advantage of low wages to sell products they could produce themselves to advanced economies. The result was that those engaged in exporting enjoyed increasing prosperity, but those who were farther from East China ports, where export industries clustered, did not. China and Japan had two problems. The first was that wages rose. Skilled workers needed to produce more sophisticated products were in short supply. Government policy focusing on exports redirected capital to businesses that were marginal at best, increasing inefficiency and costs. But most importantly, and frequently forgotten by observers of export miracles, is that miracles depend on customers who are willing and able to buy. In that sense, China's export miracle depended on the appetite of its customers, not on Chinese policy. China's employment. China's deepest fear is unemployment. If exports plunged and unemployment rose, the Chinese would face both a social and political threat of massive inequality. It would face an army of the unemployed on the coast. This combination is precisely what gave rise to the Communist Party in the 1920s, which the party fully understands. So, a solution was proposed that entailed massive lending to keep non-competitive businesses operating and wages paid. That resulted in even greater inefficiency and made Chinese exports even less competitive. China's domestic consumption. The combination of post-2008 stagnation and China's urgent attempts to maintain exports by keeping its currency low and utilize irrational banking created a political backlash when China could least endure it, which is now. China has a massive industrial system linked to the appetites of the United States and Europe. It is losing competitive advantage at the same time that political systems in some of these countries are generating new barriers to Chinese exports. There is talk of increasing China's domestic demand, but China is a vast and poor country and iPads are expensive. It will be a long time before the Chinese economy generates enough demand to consume what its industrial system can produce. China is trapped between an economic and political imperative. China's greatest fear. The US is China's greatest threat. President Donald Trump is threatening the one thing that China cannot withstand: limits on China's economic links to the United States. In addition, China must have access to the Pacific and Indian Oceans for its exports. That means controlling the South and East China Seas, which is why the US is aggressively resisting that control. Faced with this same problem in the past, Japan turned into a low-growth but stable country. But Japan did not have 1 billion impoverished people to deal with, nor did it have a history of social unrest and revolution. China's problem is no longer economic, its economic reality has been set. It now has a political problem: how to manage massive disappointment in an economy that is now simply ordinary. It also must determine how to manage international forces, particularly the United States, that are challenging China and its core interests. We will talk more about the US and Chinese conflict over control of the South and East China Seas in episode 3 of The Rise of China. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and notifications. Please like and share the video, and we would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Finally, KJ Vids is a fully independent media company. In order to produce more mini documentaries on history and geopolitics, we need your support. You can help by becoming a KJ Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Please visit our Patreon page for more information. That's all for now. See you next time.